Hello everybody! If you're watching this video, you likely at one point in your life have experienced the sensation of asking yourself, is the MMO I'm playing too easy or is it too difficult? Or maybe both. Well, I would like to propose that Legion has potentially fixed that issue entirely, or they are on the precipice of doing so. We will talk about that. But first, the dungeon in the background you are seeing is Violet Hold. It's Mythic Violet Hold. Violet Hold is a dungeon that they've ported over from Wrath of the Lich King, which all goes back to the design philosophies from Burning Crusade. Now, Burning Crusade was notoriously the most difficult WoW expansion. In early Burning Crusade, and I did play all of it, you had to CC everything. In dungeons, they nerfed heroic dungeons because they were so difficult, and over the course of time, after like late Black Temple era or early Sunwell era, you just didn't need to CC things anymore. You could pretty much get through with face tanking everything. And you know what? As a bear tank mainly back then, I really enjoyed it because bear tanks were highly sought out for. They were easy to heal in heroic dungeons. But once you got to that late Sunwell era, unless you didn't have the gear, you didn't need to worry about that. But there was one dungeon in particular where the design philosophy of Violet Hold comes into, which is the Black Morass. In the Black Morass, it was a Caverns of Time dungeon where there were portals and portal guardians would spawn out of them. You had to kill the portal guardians to close the portal, but as you were fighting that, droves of enemies would come through the portal, and it was pretty much a rinse and repeat thing. You would kill 6 portal guardians, and then at the end of that, a boss would spawn, you kill the boss, and it would just continue so on and so forth until you finally got to the final boss of that dungeon. Pretty interesting design at the time. It hadn't been done, so it was kind of cool to see. But in the end, that dungeon was deemed not very good. It was pretty hard to get through just because it was kind of a slog. You kind of were waiting on the timer of the dungeon a lot of the time once you had the gear for it, and it wasn't very fun. Well, they went into Wrath of the Lich King with that philosophy of we could probably make something kind of cool like that with that same idea, so they made the Violet Hold, which is a prison inside Dalaran. It made a lot of sense considering the main city for that expansion was Dalaran. So to have a dungeon inside the main city would be pretty cool. It was a magical prison where there were multiple kinds of enemies stored by the Kirin, and it was the same concept: portals, portal guardians, you kill them, after a certain amount of waves, a boss would spawn. But in this case, the bosses would change it up. There were more bosses in the dungeon than would spawn in a single run-through, so you would get, mixed and matched bosses or bosses you hadn't seen before, and it was really fun, and it was really farmed out. You could really farm that place for a lot of different gear, not to mention the fact that certain gear would only drop from certain bosses, so in order to get that boss to spawn and then get that piece of gear, you had to do it quite a few times. Well, they've taken that idea of the Violet Hold, a notorious dungeon, a lot of people liked it, some people didn't, and put it in Legion. And now we have this version of it where the Portal Guardians are getting additional abilities through the course of going up to Mythic and stuff, and the dungeon is really cool and very well scaled. You have the same idea of multiple bosses, more bosses than will spawn in the dungeon, so you'll see different bosses as you go through. There's a lot of replayability. Now, this is on Mythic, so it is a little bit more difficult, and what I want to propose is that through the idea of Mythic Plus, which is a thing that is not yet released, but was pretty extensively tested in the beta, it will be released in a couple weeks, that they have solved the issue of difficulty and having something as difficult as the player needs it to be. So, if you're watching this, you're probably looking at it going, this doesn't look very difficult. It isn't. Mythic is not a very difficult, difficulty, I guess is the only way to put it. But Heroic isn't either. Heroic is actually very easy. Normals are really meant for leveling up. So you have 3 major difficulties. You have Normal, again, meant for leveling up. Heroic, meant for gearing up as soon as you hit 110. Mythic, meant for once you're kind of geared up, to continue your gearing up process so you're ready for raids when they come out with Mythic Plus. And if you are a player of a different MMO, I totally get it. I know exactly your point of view. You're looking at this as a WildStar player going, that is really easy looking. That's like my level up process. I get it, man. I played WildStar. It's meant to be a difficult MMO. Okay, we get it. We get it. You like difficulty. You like interrupt armor. We get it. If you're a SWTOR player, you're going, oh my gosh, they have dungeons. Those are other players. I'm not used to seeing other players because I'm used to doing my single player content. Wait, they're actually getting content patches for dungeons? It makes no sense. I feel you, man. We're here. We're here for you. And if you're a Guild Wars player, you're probably sipping on your latte with your hipster glasses saying, I'll never play WoW, so why am I watching this video? Well, that's a good question. You should rethink your life. But if you're a WoW player, you're going, this looks just like typical heroic dungeon. Why is this mythic? Or this looks like a mythic dungeon from Warlords. Why is this a big deal that may have fixed this issue? Well, with Mythic Plus, they've stolen some ideas from Diablo, which they can totally do because they've come up with that concept, which is the idea of the Greater Rift system. Now, in Diablo, a Greater Rift is when you basically get this keystone from the end of a Rift Guardian, and a rift is just a randomized dungeon that you can farm over and over for loot. Has different enemy types bound together, different map layouts, different bosses at the end. And at the end, when you kill the boss, you get a Greater Rift keystone. You can then do a Greater Rift. A Greater Rift is basically the same concept, but with infinite scaling. Every single time you go up a Greater Rift level, things go up by 10% damage and 10% health. So after let's say you did Greater Rift 25, which is the equivalent of Torment 6, which is something that most people can do in Diablo. But then you went up to Greater Rift 35 with that keystone. Well, that basically makes it so you are 10 or 100% more difficult than Greater Rift 25. All right, I mean, that's a rough estimate. That's just giving you an idea of how it works. That's not exactly how it works, but that's an idea of how it works. So as you go up in difficulty with these Greater Rifts, it's scaling infinitely as you go, up to a point where your gear, the gear level that you can get in the game, will reach a point, a matching point of difficulty in the Greater Rifts that you just can't get any higher until you keep farming your Paragon levels, which will give you base stat, which will make it so that way you are able to do higher and higher Greater Rifts. That's the way that system works. They've taken that concept and they've made it really, really cool in WoW. So what happens is when you finish, and this is once it's out, it's not out yet, once you finish a mythic dungeon, you'll get a mythic keystone for that dungeon. And it will be a better and more difficult version of that dungeon. Things will get more HP, they will do more damage. As you level that keystone up by doing that mythic dungeon, in a time frame, there is a time frame allotment, and you manage to kill everything with the upgraded damage and health, then it will upgrade that keystone, so on and so forth, until you get to a certain difficulty, and this is where it starts to differ from Diablo, where things will have modifiers on them and affixes, which is stuff that, again, you kind of see from Diablo, where maybe every dude in the dungeon will put a healing debuff on whatever they attack. Or maybe every second while you're in the dungeon, you're taking 30,000 damage. So you then have to start thinking of this dungeon, which was easy before. The mythic, keystone, the mythic plus keystone would scale the damage and the health up to make it more challenging for you. But suddenly now you have modifiers on everything in the dungeon. That means you have to rethink the way you do the dungeon. Suddenly, with that healing debuff, you should run 2 tanks. So that first tank could have a bit of a break. And get that healing debuff off, and then you're kind of doing this cool rotation on the trash. Or if you have that healing debuff where it's just doing a tick of damage every single second you're in the dungeon, then maybe having a druid healer will be really good because the heal over times will help negate that, right? So now you're starting to have to think of these dungeons you've done a billion times at different levels of difficulty in a different way, because you now need to be able to offset the challenge that the affixes are giving to you. Now, you'll see these before you enter the dungeon with the keystone, and at the end of the week, once you've completed them all in their time limit, you will get your gear. don't necessarily get your gear up front by doing it. You get it at the end of the lockout period, and it'll just give you a ton of gear. People in the beta were receiving like 50 or 60 pieces, completing really high Mythic plus keystones. And I think that is really cool, because not only is it the best gear that you can get outside of Mythic rating, because it is the exact same item level at a certain point as Mythic rating, which I think is really cool, because it allows Mythic raiders to have another way of doing content that's actually getting them geared and is fun for them, because it is challenging in ways that isn't just flat HP and damage. It's challenging in ways that make them rethink the strategy of dungeons, and I like that. So you have that, that concept of you're doing the dungeons in a certain amount of time with different modifiers and difficulty settings on them, and that is going to keep scaling and scaling to your gear, so you can keep doing it infinitely. So not only have they solved an issue with finding the right difficulty for the right players, but they've solved the issue of replayable content, because that content, whilst it will eventually become stale, because you'll get every single modifier in every dungeon at a certain point, you will figure it all out, right? You'll get modifications that that match up with each other or don't, and eventually you'll do it all, and you'll just have a keystone that just is generating the dungeon harder and harder for you, to the point where you can't do it. With that in mind, you will eventually do it all. So at that point, you will have played so many dungeons, you probably don't want to do Mythic Plus dungeons, or at least the ones they're giving us. And again, they're solving that issue of being overplayed by adding more dungeons, right? We already have the Karazhan announcement, which will be a Mythic-only dungeon, which means that once you get the Mythic Plus keystones in that, it'll get more and more difficult. And there's a lot of bosses in there, so that will take a long time to completely farm out properly. But it's just this cool idea that no matter where you are in the game, you can do the difficult content that you want to do. Is a Mythic Keystone 14 too difficult for you? That's fine. You can do a 13. Do you want that kind of difficulty spike? No? Well, then you could just go do a Mythic dungeon. They've provided this idea and design philosophy that allows you to do the content that you can do or want to do. If you want more difficult content, keep leveling up that keystone before turning it in to get your gear. And once you do get that gear, you're going to feel rewarded for doing what you did, because you're going to get the gear that you need, because it'll be the item level that you want it at, based on the difficulty that you did it, and you're going to get the amount that you want in order to kind of get some good rolls on stuff, right? I think it is a really cool concept. It is a really cool idea, but currently only exists in dungeons. And this is why I say I think they're at the precipice of solving this issue. They have solved this issue in a way that makes sense for most players to be able to go do these dungeons. The dungeons now are meaningful content. Instead of at a certain point, you just stop doing dungeons and you're only a Mythic Plus Raider, or Mythic Raider rather. And that's all you ever do. Maybe you do some world quests at that point, but then that's all you do. Well, with this Mythic Plus dungeon idea, you have something to do every week that isn't dungeons. So you have a reason to log on and play outside of your raid lockouts. And it's a cool concept, but I wonder how much further they could take it. Could they do that with raids? Could they do that with questing? Could they do that with anything else in the game to make sure that the player is meeting up with their expectation of difficulty and what they want and can do, to the point where they are customizing the content to their liking? It's an interesting idea. I think there's a lot more to expand here. Now, I'm not a game designer, so I can't come up with ways to expand upon this. I'm sure you guys could even come up with more clever ways to use this Mythic Plus system, or alter it to be a bit cooler or a bit more player-friendly. But at its current time, it has a really cool idea, really cool concept. And in a couple weeks' time, we will see if they have solved the issue of content getting too easy at a certain point for certain players, or too difficult for certain players. Because imagine Karazhan comes out with 7.1, and because it's a Mythic-only dungeon, it might be too difficult for some players to do. And that's fine, right? But they have made Mythic fairly easy, fairly doable. When those players manage to get the gear from doing other stuff in the game, doing their world quests, getting gear upgrades and stuff, they will eventually be able to do Karazhan, which means they'll get through that content. And then if they get to the point where it's too easy for them and they want to try to do a little bit more difficult, they could do Mythic Plus on that. And then later down the line, we get a second raid out, a third raid out, more dungeons during this expansion. Then all of this scales infinitely, and we have content that helps remove the idea of a content drought that we've experienced in the previous 2 expansions, and gives players content to do that's going to keep getting them gear. And that's not even considering the idea that they have alts to go and do this stuff with as well. I think this very well may be a turning point, not for WoW, but for the entire MMO industry. If we can solve the issue of things being either too difficult or too easy for players, because that's the problem, right? Something that is too difficult for one player is going to be far too easy for another player. And that's why, you know, like competitive multiplayer games are really popular, because they're going to be matched up with the players that are meant to be played against, right? For that skill level. And that difficulty scales based on that player. You know, if you're the best player in the world, you're going to be playing against other best players in the world. If you're the worst player in the world, you're going to be playing against other worst players, and then that's how that difficulty scales in a multiplayer setting. But in an MMO, it's hard to do that kind of thing, because the dungeon is pre-generated and has, you know, very specific stats. But if you can scale that infinitely, and you solve that issue of the players doing then the difficult content that they want to do, and getting rewarded for it, and that's kind of the thing, is eventually you're going to be only rewarded for up to a certain item level, because it locks at a certain item level for that content patch. So if they can solve that issue, it's going to change the way a lot of other games do that. And then those games, maybe trying a Mythic Plus dungeon concept, will then come up with different ideas, and we'll have WoW change it. And I think over the course of the next expansion, not just Legion, but the next expansion, we're going to see a really cool transition in MMO PvE content as far as difficulty is concerned. And I'm excited for that. I think it's a really cool idea. Let me know what your thoughts are on all this. I think we are quite literally on the precipice of changing how all of this works, and if it works in Legion, then it works, and if it doesn't, then oh well, it was a good effort, right? At least they tried, and I want to see where it goes from here. I think it's a cool idea. But yeah, let me know your thoughts. What kind of content you plan on doing? Do you plan on doing Mythic Plus content? Do you have a group for it? Do you not have a group for it? Do you plan on doing it with a pug? And if you can do it with a pickup group, then, you know, how high of a Mythic Plus dungeon do you think you can do? Maybe you'll find friends that way. Who knows? But with all of that being said, we shall see you guys next time.